is an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Unspoiled, covering The Magician's Guild by Trudi Canavan. The final chapters and epilogue. In these chapters, everything winds up working out for the best because these human beings all talk to each other like human beings and jump to reasonable conclusions and listen to one another. And this is my very favorite kind of story. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Ashleigh for commissioning this episode and the last two. Almost the entire book, I believe. I think there was one other person who stepped in at one point. But thank you very much, Ashleigh, and I'm delighted to add this to the list of books that I have completed. I am so pleasantly surprised by how this book ended. I have to confess that I was startled in the last episode when I checked how many chapters were left to see how close I was to the end of the book. It is a really compact story, to be honest, compared to some of the things that I have covered, not only for Spoil Me, but just for the podcast overall. And it is a really, what's the word I want? It's one of those stories that is this is so weird. You know, we talk about fiction as a means of living out our deepest fantasies at times. Things of the fantasy of being powerful, of having magic, of having money, of having romance, whatever the case may be. Maybe the feeling of justice being served and yada, yada, yada. But this fulfilled my fantasy, which has been really stifled lately, of reasonable people who use logic to solve their problems and who actually listen to one another and use the tools at their disposal to determine the truth. This is such a low bar that it's incredibly depressing when you really think about it, that this is sort of a fantasy situation. But I went into this wondering if we were going to end this book with Sonea in Fergun's hands, if that was going to be the kind of what do you call it? The sort of cliffhanger, I guess. And I am just so gratified that that is not what happened, because it really could have been, and I don't even want to say that I would have been angry about that happening in terms of the writing. I don't think I'd be oh, author, what are you doing? Because that's a very valid way to end things. And it might even have been really interesting and compelling and made me want to move on to the next one. But in order to get that to happen, a lot of things would have had to be ignored, or people would have had to behave in a way that felt really unreasonable. And I'm just so happy that it's turned out the way that it did. And yet, there is still something going on that everybody is concerned about. And by everybody, I mean Sonea and the administrator and Rothen, because they are the only ones who are knowing about it at this point. So, yeah, I think that this was handled really well, and it was a satisfying wrap-up. And it all happened in a way that, despite my growing suspicion that it was all going to turn out okay, that did not cause me to lose interest, which that's what happens when things are going to turn out okay, but the stakes don't feel like they're there. You lose interest because you feel well, of course, I know everything's going to work out because of course it is. So I'm not going to, I did not know everything was going to work out. I wasn't sure how long this was going to go on. And as I began to see that things were leading towards it all working out, I almost started to become more concerned because I thought that there was a wrench that could be thrown in things right at the very end. And it turns out that there is a little bit of a wrench in that there's another problem to deal with, but it's not the wrench that I expected, which was that Fergun was going to do something crazy and wind up getting his way after all. So anyway, now that I've talked over my reactions to death, I want to talk about the like overarching story here with Sonea finding out Fergun's actual intentions. So we start off this next chapter because this hasn't, like, Fergun reveals himself in a way much sooner than I thought. Or I guess it's not even sooner because he sort of, his hand is pushed, but it's more that he's so obvious about it that I kind of expected more from him as a villain. I thought he'd be a little bit less direct about what he was doing. And I'm glad that he is as direct as he is, but that is the one thing that I kind of had a bit of a problem with. And this is a fine point, and I won't actually like get hung up on this too much. But I do want everybody who is reading this to think about, if you lived in a world where you knew that you were constantly being monitored, stay with me, would you have phrased everything as baldly and openly as Fergun does? And I realize that people listening and being in the room and hearing you is not surveillance, but the fact that their minds can be read if push comes to shove, in my opinion, if I were living here and I were used to this and knew that this could happen, I would be a lot sketchier and more careful about how I phrased things and how I revealed my hand. And it would be the kind of wording that, like, yeah, we all know what I meant, but I didn't actually say it, and that's not actually evidence. Or at least if it's considered evidence, it's very sketchy. And if we're going with like the reasonable doubt scenario, it's not going to be enough. So again, I'm not too concerned about this, but because of the fact that I was so surprised at how like direct he is when he says to her exactly what his intentions are, it really stuck out to me once it was time for the administrator to read her mind, that she has the exact wording out of his mouth that she would need for the administrator to know precisely what was going on. Like, that just really kind of struck me as convenient. And I don't know how they handle trials and things. If even, you know, like I'm saying, I'm approaching this from the perspective of like American law enforcement and the technicalities that you can use as loopholes to get somebody out of a situation when everybody knows perfectly well what they really meant by whatever they said or did. It's just that you can't prove it. That might not be how it works here. He might have guarded his words more carefully, and still, because everybody knows who he is and what he intended, then it would still have been just as damning. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that because I feel like that's something that I would be very conscious of, that every interaction I have with somebody can be recounted as if it were on video, if necessary, especially like from person to person. It doesn't even necessarily need to be in a case of like something as grandiose as a trial or hearing or anything. It could just be like a friend of mine that I was talking shit about, for example, and somebody decides to go tell that friend, and they're able to play back the exact recording of me talking shit. That's a lot, you know? It's different than somebody just being like, well, she was just saying that you shouldn't have gotten that promotion because blah, blah, blah. It would be actually me going, I can't believe that fucking bitch got that promotion. I bust my ass around here, and these people, she doesn't do shit. Do they see how much I cover for her? That's what she would hear instead of just this like paraphrased. And so I feel like I'd be so much more paranoid about that. And I wonder if that comes into play at all later, you know, because like, this is a different world that Sonea is getting involved in. So in later books, I wonder if she has guarded her behavior a little bit more, if she is more aware of that, if part of the reason that they don't worry is because they're so used to it that it doesn't even occur to them to try and like cover their tracks, but she might not feel that way because this is new to her. So I'll be interested to see if that's any factor whatsoever. And also, I'm just like, okay, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself again because we're not even here yet. Sonea is being led around by Rothen, and he misunderstands exactly why she's being so brooding and quiet about everything. He is trying to show her the different disciplines and how they work in order to give her an idea of what she could accomplish or be capable of if she decided to stay, which she's completely aware of what he's doing. Like, he's not being subtle about this, and she is not being stupid about it. And he takes her to see, like, the warriors, because he doesn't really think through what kind of impression that's going to make on her. But yeah, she's not impressed by the warriors. She is actually really disturbed at seeing them, like, throwing magic around in the way that they did that killed the dude that was standing right next to her. Which I feel like, Rothen, buddy, you're a good guy, but, like, think things through. God. And she winds up getting much more interested in the healing one, which we had been hinted at before. I'm like sort of ambivalent about the like implication in the first chapters where we see the guild at the fact that healing is more often taken up by women, because I feel like there's a kind of like internalized misogyny there that bums me out. And the fact that that does indeed seem to be the discipline that she's drawn to, I was kind of like, well, but you know what? If that's the way it is, then that's the way it is. And she is really touched to see a little boy who decided to fuck around with his father's sword and got his hand cut up pretty bad, healed really quickly. And it's not, again, a complete heal. We saw before how a woman who had a broken arm, they were able to fix the break, but also get they got a sling for her arm, because even though the break was fixed, she was not completely 100% healed. She still needed to like rest and give her body time to finish up. So that's what's happening here, is that they heal the actual cuts so that there are just some very thin lines, and they still put a bandage and dressing on it, and they still tell him not to use it and let it rest. And, you know, I find that really interesting, and I like that. I like when things are made better and easier, but not so easy as to be a foregone conclusion that if somebody gets hurt, it's just not a big deal and you don't have to worry about it. So there's that Sonea sees, which really affects her. And there's also the use of the anesthetic gel, which Rothen doesn't think she's going to want to do, because it's an actual, like, you know, magician created medicine that's being applied to her skin, and she's so suspicious of them that I think he thought she would decline anything that might influence her, or, you know, because when you don't trust somebody, you're not going to let them do things to your body. But she seems to have relaxed, and she allows Indira, is that her name, to do it, which is really surprising to him. And I kind of enjoyed the fact that she is so Indria. Sorry, not Indira, Indria. I like the fact that she's so open at this point, that she's sort of relaxing a little bit, despite the fact that Fergun, like, this is what I mean about the reasonable part of these personalities. When I say that, I don't just mean like they see what Fergun did and decide to punish him, which is like fucking basic. I'm talking about she could easily have been written, and this is something that gets done a lot in less well thought out, well written work. It could have been the kind of thing where Fergun becomes to her the face of everybody, that despite the fact that she has been taught by Rothen and he has gained her trust, and he should be the yardstick by which she is measuring everyone, despite the fact that she has met other magicians who also seem to be good-hearted people who are sincere, a lesser writer would fall back on Fergun as the means for completely unraveling any faith that she has in anybody who is a magician. And this would lead to her not only not trusting Fergun, but not trusting Rothen or anybody, and thus winding up shooting herself in the foot and not letting her mind be read by the administrator later because she doesn't want them in her head. All kinds of things that would lead to a terrible conclusion for her and for other people, because somebody decided to be lazy about how they wrote this and felt it would be more interesting if things were very black and white, and rather than trusting one person but not everyone, or some people and not one, they just had her not trust any at all. That's the kind of thing that I was afraid of happening. And when I saw that she was willing to let them put the anesthetic on her hand here, and the way that she reacts to some things that Fergun says later, that was when my faith, because it is, I'm not saying that these characters were not written in a nuanced way up till this point, but often that will be the case until the final, kind of climactic confrontation or reveal. And then suddenly a writer will find that they have written themselves into a corner, and they decide that they are going to fall back on much more basic behavior of their characters in order to wrap things up and have this huge kind of set piece moment happen. And that was really what I was worried about, was that it was going to be all reasonable people talking and being open and discussing right up until the end. And that was when everything was going to fall apart for her in terms of her trust. And that loss of trust would lead to this huge problem. So I was really dreading that. And I don't think I realized as I was reading just how much I believed that was what was going to happen. I don't, I haven't read these books. I don't know this author. I just have been burned so many times before in that department that I think I just assumed that there was the possibility of that. So this moment when she lets him put this anesthetic gel and she's really watching the healing and seems to be absorbing it and actually moved by what she's seeing gave me some hope. I liked the fact also that we get direct confirmation that she knows exactly what Lord Rothen is doing in trying to convince her to stay by showing her all of these different disciplines. And there's the tour of the alchemy rooms, which she's the most interested in not interested, but most curious about, because she simply does not know anything about alchemy and what that entails. And I was kind of curious about that myself, and we don't wind up getting to see that tour. So I'm wondering if we get to find out more about that later. But she gets dropped off back in her chambers, and this is when Fergun comes to answer. And she knows that he's going to be coming by soon, and that he's going to be expecting an answer once he does. But at this point, she doesn't really understand his intentions. And so she lets him in, and they're having a conversation where she basically is thinking through everything that he has told her about his plan. And here, the first thing that happens is when he asks, "How is your control lesson going?" And she says, "It's going well, I think. I had to lift a box off the floor. That wasn't easy." Fergun drew in a sharp breath, his eyes widening, and Sonea felt her heart skip in response. "What he is teaching you is not a control exercise. He is showing you how to use your magic. If he is doing that, you must already have control." Sonea felt a thrill of excitement and hope. He said he was testing my control. Fergun shook his head gravely. All magic is a test of control. He wouldn't be teaching you to lift objects unless your control was sufficiently established. You're ready, Sonea. Leaning back in her chair, Sonea felt a smile pulling at the corners of her mouth. At last, she thought, I can go home. An unexpected twinge of regret followed the thought. Once gone, she might never see Rothen again. So, are you satisfied that what I told you is true? That Rothen has kept information from you? She looked at Fergun and nodded. Most of it. Administrator Lorlan explained the blocking of power to me. Fergun looked surprised. Lorlan himself? Good. He told me it would not be unpleasant and that I'd never notice it after. If it works properly. The guild hasn't needed to do it for many, many years. He grimaced. The last time they did it, they messed it up a little, but you should not worry about that. Accept my help and you won't have to take the risk. He smiled. Are we going to work together? Have you decided to stay? No. Then are you still undecided? I'm not sure about your plan. Parts of it. If I have to be a novice, I'll have to take a vow that I know I'm going to break. And I'm not happy about doing that. So this moment where he points out that she's actually not being taught control the way Rothen is framing it. This was the moment for me that really determined how the rest of the arc of this book was going to go. If she took that, like, deception, which I did feel was pretty small, but I didn't know how she would react. If she took this as a huge breach of trust with Rothen, that would change everything. It would change how she dealt with Fergun. It would change how she approached the guild overall, because this would be yet another time that Rothen hadn't really told her the whole story. And I was, as soon as he tells her exactly the truth, I groaned a little bit, because I was like, oh man, this is it. This is the moment where she decides that she doesn't believe anything. And instead, she is thinking about how if she were in Rothen's shoes, she would also have lied to herself. Like, that if she were trying to convince somebody to stay and trying to draw it out, that she would also show them a little bit of what they could do in a real way versus just the control, in order to tempt them to make the choice to stay. And that was the moment that I breathed a huge sigh of relief in terms of how this was all going to play out. Not just that I needed her to trust Rothen for my own satisfaction. Quite aside from that, it was just a logical line of thinking. She was just being a smart person, putting herself in the shoes of another to assess what they had done. And there is nothing in the world that I respect more than having that kind of empathy and self-awareness. Like, I am that way to a fault, to be honest. Like, I've been told that I need to sometimes just own the way that I feel instead of always having to see it from another point of view if somebody has hurt me or done something to me. And that may be true, but I find it useful a lot of the time. And I really, really appreciated that this was the way that she thought about it, and that she understood Rothen well enough to be able to do that, that she understood his personality enough to give him the benefit of the doubt and recognize that that probably was his goal, and that he is not a monster who has been lying to her this whole time, because she's also been in his mind. So she has been able to see that to a degree, you know, like, there's only so much that you can hide when you're exchanging information with people. And his intent has been pretty clear for her to see. So yeah, this is when she tells him, Fergun, that she's going to need some more time. And she tries to put him off in ways that sound very legitimate. Like, even if your plan does work, I'll still have the guild hunting me. If I return to the slums with magic, the thieves will want me to work for them. I don't want to be their tool. And he's like, well, I'll be able to hide your magic. They won't be able to find you. But if you have magic and the thieves want you, they can't make you do anything you don't want to do. And she then mentions about how the thieves have other ways of making people do things. I might not be able to be hurt, but they could hurt my friends or my family, which Fergun seems to take as like a fucking invitation, because this is when he tells her that he has Sari. He puts the knives down on the table, which she immediately recognizes, and tells her, you're going to tell Rothen you've decided to stay. When you do, he'll announce you've achieved control so he can get you into the guild before you change your mind again. There'll be a meet in a week and a hearing to decide who will be your guardian. At this hearing, you're going to tell everyone that during the purge, I saw you before Rothen did. You'll tell them I looked at you after the stone flashed through the barrier and before it struck. When you tell them this, the higher magicians will have no choice but to grant me your guardianship. You'll enter the guild, but I assure you it won't be for long. Once you've performed a little task for me, you'll be sent back where you belong. You'll get what you want, and so will I. You have nothing to lose from helping me, but you'll lose that little friend of yours if you don't. So she winds up coming to a conclusion that makes a lot of sense and for some reason had not really occurred to me. And that is that he wants her to be part of the guild briefly in order to force her to do something that will dishonor her and will dishonor dwells in general, to hammer home the fact that only nobility deserves to be in the guild and practice magic. Basically, he's a classist snob who can't stand the idea of going to school with a normie, and he wants her to embarrass herself so that he can paint everybody of lower classes with the same brush and make it so that, kind of without even giving too much thought to it, in the future, if they find somebody from the dwells who has magic, they will block the magic without really thinking twice about it and send people back out into the slums. And that may become the custom, that might be something that it's a matter of course. So I don't know why I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but that is 100% like a method that happens in the real world for dealing with like people who are part of minority groups that are held in suspicion, is to set them up so that they seem like they've done something they haven't, and then you get to treat the entire group in this manner. It didn't even enter my head. And so the fact that Sonea sees that and voices that, I was like, oh shit, okay, there it is. Because, you know, someone in the audience last time, I think it might have been Martin, mentioned that he was probably taking Sari for blackmail. But I didn't think that he would be this bold about it. He just comes out and tells her, I have him and I will kill him if you don't join. And if you tell anybody about what I told you, I won't reveal where he is. And that way he will starve to death, which is a pretty solid, like, he hadn't thought of the possibility of somebody else figuring out where Sari was, but he did think of everything else and kind of have a backup plan. It was a pretty solid, like, she was, as far as she was concerned, she did not have a choice, you know? And so in that respect, it was just a more airtight but more direct and ruthless method than I had expected. I sort of thought he was going to do something to set it up as if maybe somebody else had captured Sari. Almost like my fear about her losing faith in the magicians in general. I thought he was going to set it up that she lost faith because she discovered Sari was hidden, and that maybe Fergun could do something to convince Sari to tell her that it was somebody else who had imprisoned him, and lay blame at the feet of one of the other magicians. And thus she would agree to Fergun's terms because she'd feel like he had been a friend to her when other people had lied to her. I would argue my plan is better. However, it's not fleshed out, and I don't know how complicated that would be to set up. And also, now that they have this like mind reading method, it's really probably impossible to pull off, because you'd be able to say, no, I didn't do it. And you can look right in my head and see, and I will let you see everything. And so it's an interesting kind of like combination here, is that you can see the absolute truth. And so setting people up is pretty difficult. The key being, you set people up without them knowing that you're setting them up, and thus they don't get a chance to defend themselves in the first place. Then you're probably going to succeed. So planting doubts in her head about what Rothen is doing is a good method if she's not able to directly ask Rothen, did you do this? Martin saying, but then surely the High Lord can read Fergun's mind and find Sari even unwillingly. That's true. I guess the High Lord can force, because that was part of the thing too, is that you can't force people to answer questions that they don't want to answer. But you can see the truth if that is what they want you to see. But the High Lord would have to get involved. So I guess that's the question, is like, how much prodding does it take to get him involved in the situations, you know, go. And it seems like it doesn't take that much. Like, we're going to talk a little bit later. I'm like halfway through and I'm not even a quarter of the way through what I've read. So let me speed this up a little bit. She winds up agreeing. She's just horrified at the fact that Fergun is this petty and vengeful that he would not only be like this about the Dwells, but also hold a grudge against her the way that he clearly does, which had not occurred to her because she didn't realize that he was the one she hit with a rock. I thought she kind of knew that. I don't know where I thought that from, if there was something I read that gave me that impression, but it's not until this scene that she realizes exactly who he is. So then we get her telling Rothen that she's staying, and he's just so delighted and is going to celebrate. Also, he tells her about the fact that the thieves told them where to find her, which I didn't know was a direct thing. But apparently they did, which, while it's understandable that they did this, later on when she mentions this to Sari, you can see Sari's face sort of light up, because this is a huge bargaining chip to use against them. That I know that you like swore a favor to us and then backed out of it and betrayed us. And that is a real ding against y'all's reputation, because you caved to the magicians, which is supposed to be like the very people that you are always working against. So I enjoy him having that leverage too. So then comes the reveal to everybody else that he has decided to stay. Rothen explaining to her about the way that the bowing and the titles are really important to certain people. And she asks if it's important to him. And he says, it's not really, but there are times when it's very obvious that someone leaving off my title or not bowing is meant to be rude. So it's not exactly that I have the pride of worrying about somebody not doing this and it injuring me. It's more that they intend it to injure me. And so I know that, and it's meant to be offensive. So she is like really struggling now with knowing that she won't be able to stay, because she had reconsidered everything. And she finally, like, she tells Fergun later on that I don't even know that you really have Sari. I think that if you have his knives, you can say that you have him, and that's all that you've got. And he tries to be like, oh, I wouldn't make this kind of threat. And she's like, listen, I worked with the thieves. I know exactly how these kinds of threats and this kind of blackmail works. You show me that you have him, or no deal at all. And I enjoyed this a lot, because it really shows that as devious and shitty as Fergun is, he is not experienced in this kind of thing. And she is. She has dealt with this kind of person, with somebody who's really ruthless and willing to do whatever it takes. And he may be that kind of person, but he has not gotten to like spread his wings, so to speak, in this sphere before. What he's doing is very sort of vulgar in a way. And I don't think he had stooped to this level. Everything that he has done so far that we have seen against, like, Dannyl, for example, has been him spreading rumors and whispers and things that are much more difficult to substantiate, but in the end can be more damaging, because there's no direct way to confront a lot of it without lending it credence and validity. So what he's doing, just keeping somebody prisoner and threatening to kill them, like, that's a little beneath him. And I think he feels that. And so her pointing out that she knows something that he doesn't about this is really wounding to his pride. So he winds up taking her to see Sari. And Sari, this is when she gets told by... he tells her basically that, I have to be honest with you, I didn't want you to join the magicians because you had only just come back after like retreating with your aunt and uncle and trying to live an honest life again. You'd only just joined up with us Dwells, and I missed you. And if you decided to stay with the magicians, I was not going to get to see you the same way. And I really care about you. And that was selfish. And if you don't join up with the magicians, everybody's going to think you're stupid or crazy, because there is nobody out there who has not secretly wished that they had magic. And if they were in your shoes, 100% without a doubt, they would absolutely become part of the guild. So I'm really sorry that I was being so selfish and like kind of tried to influence you to not go. But I've had a lot of time to think, and that was not a fair decision. That was not, I wasn't thinking of you, I was thinking of myself. And what a great moment, Sari. Like, again, with this imprisonment could have been his leverage to prove to her that she should not stay. He could have leaned into being selfish and been like, do you see what they're doing to people? You really want to be part of this? And absolutely would have been valid in saying that, because he has not met the other magicians. So he doesn't really know that Fergun is one of the only ones. And I'm saying one of, because clearly there are other snobs that side with Fergun at the end. But he is not aware of how kind and good-hearted and honest others have been with her. So he could easily decide that all the magicians are like this. The only evidence to support that they aren't all like this is the fact that Fergun is clearly keeping him a secret from others as well. Like, there's not a bunch of guards that are stationed around him. He is there, this is not sanctioned. He is coming in the dead of night with food secretly. And, the whole thing is just really obviously Fergun's dirty little secret. So Sari's, again, I'm pointing this out, using logic, putting pieces together, and having some self-awareness and reflection, and realizing that he had ulterior motives for the way that he talked about the magicians and the way that he spoke to Sonea. And she takes this to heart. Once he says it, it's like a combo of her thinking about things in a way that she hadn't before. And also, she wants to stay at this point anyway. And so he's saying something that just supports something that she already wants, which, let's face it, we are all far more receptive to hearing things that support what we already believe. So that moment, and Fergun finally comes in and busts it between the two of them. And she's trying to set up a means of sending messages so that she can get constant reassurance that Sari is still alive, because she knows there's the possibility that she gives Fergun what he wants and he kills Sari anyway, because that's kind of something that the thieves might do. So she wants to create a system between the two of them to ensure that she's getting messages that only Sari could send her, so that she knows that he's still alive. But they get cut off, and as it turns out, it is an unnecessary precaution to take because he winds up being discovered anyway. So this, okay, I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. When she's being led down there, we have Dannyl seeing her with Fergun, and it's not so egregious that he's with her. I mean, he can be with her because he's putting in for her guardianship, so that's fine. But the fact that she took, or that he took her out of Rothen's chambers and is giving her a tour is overstepping a little bit. And Dannyl's a little shocked that he sees this and connects with Rothen mentally and is like, did you know that he's doing this? This is not really what's supposed to happen. And Rothen is of the opinion, well, no, it's not supposed to happen. But you also, it's good for everybody else to see him sort of pushing it a little bit too much and being a little bit overeager and stepping forward too often. So that might help my case, actually. So just let him do his thing. Dannyl, however, is too curious, because when he follows them, all of a sudden they're gone, and he tries a few doors and the door hinges are super squeaky. There's no way that they could have gone into a separate room or turned a corner or anything without him catching up to them or seeing it or hearing it. And yet it's just dead silent, and all of a sudden their voices are gone and they seem to have disappeared, and he cannot figure this out. So he starts to push it a little bit more and continues searching the areas, because initially he doesn't know what could have happened. But when he goes to talk to Rothen, Rothen's like, I mean, maybe the underground tunnels. And Dannyl's like, oh my God, totally the underground tunnels. I can't believe I didn't think of that. And Rothen's like, well, first of all, he's not supposed to go down there. I don't see why he would be doing that. Second of all, you should not go down there to look for them because I doubt that's where they are anyway, and you're going to get in trouble because it's a rule that we don't do that because they're super dangerous and could cave in at any moment. But Dannyl is on the track now, and he is not going to be put off. Thank goodness for that. So he's down, he goes down finally, and he's like just exploring this during the hearing. So he has to tell Rothen to draw things out. Rothen, at this point, we have this whole hearing, and she gets up there and lies, and Rothen is like not only hurt by the lie, but also really startled as he sees who Fergun actually is for the first time. Like, Fergun gets this smug little smile on his face, and Rothen sees it before he realizes that Rothen is looking and stops smiling. So it's a really like, it's one of those moments of just like, oh my God, I was so wrong about who you are. And people tried to tell me and I didn't believe them. And now here it is. So he's realizing for the first time. And at the same time, Dannyl is trying to figure out what the hell he was hiding down in the tunnels. There's this moment where Dannyl's down there and he's finally figured out the entrance to the tunnel because he stopped and talked to a servant who said that there was food all over the floor and even on one of the paintings, and that people aren't supposed to have food down here. So somebody's been breaking the rules, and he realizes that painting is probably the entrance to the tunnel. So he's able to get in there, and I had forgotten like how long of a series of passages it is to like when Sari gets led down there the first time because he's blindfolded. But it is a bit of, even after he finds the entrance to the tunnel, it's not like he just walks in and there's Sari. He has to figure out where Sari is. And here's this moment. Lord Dannyl, might I inquire as to your reasons for being here? Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if this is the High Lord Acheron, I'm going to call him Acheron, if this is him down in these tunnels where he's told everyone they're not allowed to go, I feel like Acheron knew what was going on already with Fergun. Am I crazy? Like, why is he... I don't even want to know why he's down there, because it's obviously he's into some shady shit. So if he's told everyone they're not allowed to go down in those tunnels, I would imagine it's because he's doing something in those that he should not be doing. That aside, there's no way that he's down there and doesn't know there's something going on, right? Like, they just miss each other every time. He just never hears or smells Sari. Like, that's the thing that Dannyl zeroes in on, is that he can smell the stench because Sari's having to like piss and shit in the corner of the room. There's no friggin' toilets in here. So I have a hard time believing that Acheron is like completely unaware. And I wonder if Dannyl finding Sari didn't just sort of force his hand in revealing this, when maybe Acheron would have done something shady to Sari himself. Because as we find out later, there's a potential for taking lives from people in order to empower yourself. I don't know how serious this all is. But it was really strange to me that somebody with as finely tuned senses as Acheron, somebody who could tell that magic was being done like all the way across the city, is in the very same tunnels with this prisoner and doesn't know he's there. I just have a hard time buying that. So anyway, Sari can hear. He drew in a quick breath and pressed his ear to the door. Tunnels are extensive. It is easy to become disorientated. Magicians have been lost for days and returned starved. I suggest you retrace your steps. The voice was stern and unfamiliar. Another voice replied. Sari only caught a few words, but he understood enough to know the other magician was apologizing. The voice was also unfamiliar, but he could easily imagine Fergun's voice becoming faint and high if he was babbling so. The stern magician clearly did not approve of Fergun's presence in the passages. He was unlikely to approve of Fergun keeping prisoners down here either. All Sari had to do was call out or hammer on the door, and Fergun's trap would be unsprung. He raised his fist, then paused as the voices stopped. Hasty footsteps led away, then another set approached. Biting his lips, Sari backed away from the door. Which magician was it, Fergun or the stern stranger? So, who are you? Boomed an unfamiliar voice. What are you doing down here? Opening his eyes, Sari's relief changed to astonishment as he recognized the man standing in the doorway. So, we have Dannyl coming down here to find things and getting cut off by the High Lord. The High Lord reprimanding him and telling him to go back upstairs, but then the High Lord frees Sari anyway. The way that events unfold here is very confusing to me, and I feel like it needs to be like relevant in a later book, because there's no reason that I can see why Dannyl isn't like written to be the one who finds him and reveals this all himself. Like, the only thing that I can think is that the High Lord is aware of the feud between Dannyl and Fergun and figures that the only way this accusation will be lent credence is if he's the one who finds Sari and not Dannyl. But I don't, like, otherwise, him deciding to cut Dannyl off, send him away, and then reveal Sari himself is really strange. So yeah, I don't know, but Martin says, well, I guess you have no choice but to read the next book and find out then. I would love to. Somebody better commission it. Martin, looking at you. Or maybe Ashleigh will be interested. She just commissioned so many in such a short time that I'm like, I think Ashleigh might be tapped out for a little bit. But yeah, he winds up escorting Sari upstairs, and the minute that he comes in, poor Sonea is like, oh my God, that's the fucking assassin. What is he doing here? And then he goes and sits on the High Lord's chair, and she's like, oh no, which is pretty fun. And then she makes her accusation against Fergun, who is very, very pale with fright as he realizes that everything has come crashing down around him. And, it doesn't get much worse than the High Lord discovering everything. So she agrees to have her mind read, and Administrator Lorlin goes into her mind and I like that she can feel his responses to the things that he's seeing. So when she shows him the actual like scenes of Fergun threatening Sari and like being really snide and evil with her, that he like has this revulsion and disgust, especially when they open Sari's cell, the memory of like the stench and everything. He's just like so horrified by it. And then when he goes and it was the magician. Or I'm saying magician like Lorlin's not also a magician. It was the High Lord who had already read Sari's mind and saw the way that Sari was captured when he had assured, when Fergun had assured the High Lord that, oh, I'm just bringing him to the front gates. It's no big deal. So both their stories are found to be true. Now, here's my issue, and I'm not even like mad. This is not a writing problem. It's the fucking rich get away with everything thing. But they don't lock Fergun up. They don't do anything to him yet. There's going to be a trial, but, she gets her guardianship given over to Rothen. This is fine. This is what we want. But there's also like I don't know. He says that if Fergun shows that he's truly repentant, then he will be allowed to remain, which I don't understand how that is something they would even consider. He says, too, Fergun later, as she looked toward him, he caught her eye and sneered. Look at them, he said. One consorts with beggars, the other with thieves. His companions laughed. Shouldn't he be locked up or something? No, he'll be watched, but he knows that there's a chance he won't be expelled if he appears repentant. Most likely he'll be given a duty to perform that nobody wants, probably one that will involve working in some remote place for several years. Dislike. The last thing you want when you realize that there's a snake in your house is to lose sight of the snake. Right? Like, I want to know where that snake is. You don't want to see a spider somewhere on the wall above your bed and you look back and it's gone and you're in bed. No. Dislike all of this. Also, the fact that all he has to do is appear repentant, he's immediately making shitty remarks. He's not repentant. It's very obvious. Put this guy somewhere that he can't cause trouble, because obviously he has magic powers and could make some serious trouble. And Sari does not have magic powers, and everything that he had started off doing was directed against Sari. So at the very fucking least, you should be protecting this innocent normie who did not do anything and has been locked up and starved. Like, what the fuck, Magicians Guild? And again, I'm not mad at the writing. This feels true, because the rich and powerful have their own absurd ways of handling things that are not adequate and do not make sense and wind up accomplishing nothing. So it follows. And I'm very irritated that this book ends with, like, her in the correct guardianship, his evil plan revealed, and yet no comeuppance for him yet at all. So that really bummed me out because it felt very true to life. Also, let's talk about Lorelyn finding out what the fuck the High Lord has been up to, because he was not ready for this shit at all. Lorelyn sees the, like, edge of a memory in her head. I'm clicking back here, so forgive me when you hear all this clicking. It's me scrolling through my Kindle book. So let's see. Let's see. At the mention of the black-robed magician, Sonea sensed the painting change. As she turned toward it, Lorelyn followed her gaze and drew in a sharp breath. What is this? Within the frame stood the High Lord dressed in blood-soaked beggar's clothes. Lorelyn turned to stare at her. When did you see this? Many weeks ago. How? Where? Sonea hesitated. If she let him see the memory, he would know that she had trespassed and spied upon the guild. He had not entered her mind to see that, and she was sure he could not complain if she pushed him out. But a part of her wanted him to see. There could be no harm now in letting the magicians discover her intrusion, and she craved an answer to the mystery of the black-robed magician. Very well, it began like this. So she shows him everything about sneaking in, looking through the windows, Sari stealing books, and, as to all this, Administrator Lorelyn is just kind of amused by it and is like, oh, that's where the books went. Nobody would have guessed that. That's kind of amazing. And then finally, she shows him what she had seen. The High Lord stood in the painting again, this time wearing a black cloak. The servant arrived, and she sensed recognition from Lorelyn. Takan. It is done, the High Lord said, then removed his cloak to reveal the blood-stained clothes. Yada, yada, yada. The fight has weakened me. I need your strength. Dropping to one knee, the servant offered his arm. The High Lord ran the blade over the man's skin, then placed a hand over the wound. Sonea felt an echo of the strange fluttering within her head. No! A wave of horror swept over her. Startled by the force of Lorelyn's emotions, Sonea's concentration snapped. The painting went black, then disappeared completely. It can't be! Not Acheron! What is it? I don't understand. What did he do? So Lorelyn, I love this, with great presence of mind, no pun intended, tells her to keep cool and act like he's still reading her mind. And he's going to explain to her that, first of all, I need to think about what I'm going to do before I jump out of your head. Because if I act weird, he's going to know that I saw something or that you saw something. What you have seen is forbidden. It is what we call black magic. By using it, a magician can take strength from any living creature, human or animal. For Acheron to be using it is terrible beyond belief. He is powerful, more powerful than any of us. This must be the reason for his extraordinary strength. If that is so, then he must have been practicing these vile arts before he returned from abroad. He has broken his vow. He should be stripped of his rank and expelled. If he has used these powers to kill, the penalty is death. And finally, he has been my friend since we were both novices so many years, and I had to find this. We must remove him, but not now. He's too powerful. If we confront him and he fights us, he could easily win, and each killing he made would make him stronger. With his secret revealed and no reason to hide his crime, he could kill indiscriminately. The entire city would be in danger. So, finally, he says, like, listen, I understand that seeing this might make you feel like staying with the guild is the absolute last thing you want to do, but if this is something that he's practicing, he knows you have a lot of power in you, and I would not be surprised if you left the guild and returned to the slums and then turned up dead because he went to you as a source for strength and power and killed you, and nobody would know that it was a magical death. They wouldn't be able to recognize the signs, so it would simply seem like something had happened to you, like maybe something of natural causes or an accident or who knows. So it would be pretty unsafe, actually, at this point for you to leave the guild. And I apologize because we don't seem like the most trustworthy crew right now, and I get that. But it really is the best place for you. And she's like, so you're going to try and like take him down? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to have to. We can't let somebody who's doing this rule us. But he's really strong, and there is no way that like the people that I know and the power that we've got are going to be enough. So we will have to formulate some sort of plan in order to overpower him, because otherwise we're no match at all. So they have this very upfront conversation and come up out of her head, and he just says what she said happened is the truth and does not acknowledge or say anything about the rest of, what he saw in there. And I have a suspicion here, and if somebody commissions the next book, maybe I'll find out. But I feel like maybe this magic that he is calling black magic is not as bad as he thinks it is. Because let's talk about what we actually saw. The High Lord was out there in beggar's clothes, and he's covered in blood and said, "It is done." Clearly he killed somebody. Who did he kill? He might have killed somebody terrible. He might have done that in order to do some good. We don't know. There's a lot of bad people out there. He tells this servant, "I need your strength." Now, this is kind of a gray area. He doesn't kill the servant. He doesn't force the servant. This isn't somebody who's like trembling and protesting and he slices their arm anyway. This is somebody who's like, yeah, okay, and puts their arm out and seems to be consenting to this. Gray area because how much can a servant consent to anything? They aren't really allowed to say no, and I don't know what kind of power Acheron has, but he may be able to compel them, and we didn't see that compulsion. But there feels to me something about this whole situation that isn't about Acheron just wanting power. He is weakened after having done something and needs to get his strength back. And I don't know what that thing is that he did that caused him to lose his strength in the first place. But I feel like that's something that Acheron seems to be someone who wants to know the truth. Like, he found Sari. He made sure to, to free him, read his mind, bring him, there's all kinds of weird underhanded stuff that he could have done if all he's trying to do is gather a bunch of power together. He could have taken some of Sari's blood too. Because I assume it doesn't need to be magical blood for this to work if he was using a servant, because the servants aren't magical. So I feel like there's something else going on, maybe other sort of battle that Acheron is fighting, or other information that he's aware of, intrigues that he's involved in that they don't know about, and they're just doing their damnedest, basically, to keep this kind of power under control, because it could be really abused. And that's why he's not telling them, is that he knows they'll leap to certain conclusions, but he needs this kind of power in order to accomplish whatever it is he's trying to do, which I don't know what that is. Aren't they? Maybe they just don't test servants because they aren't nobles. That's true. Like, when I say not magical, I mean not trained. And if they aren't trained, I'm not sure how that, like, magic would work with their blood. And if they're not trained and not tested, doesn't that magic eventually start to, like, I guess they said that Sonea is an aberration in that her magic just began without anybody having to spark it. So maybe if they don't test servants, that magic could be sparked and hasn't been yet, but also has not manifested as some sort of dangerous, like, series of fires and explosions, because it doesn't normally work that way. So yeah, maybe he found somebody who has some magic blood, the servant, and is using him for those purposes. I don't know. But whatever the case, I don't get a bad guy vibe off of Acheron. I get a mysterious vibe. I get the vibe of somebody who knows way more about everything that's going on than anybody else is aware of. But I don't feel like he's somebody who's doing something, like, underhanded solely to gain power and do God knows what, rule the world. So I haven't got a lot to base this on, obviously. We haven't seen a ton of him. But maybe that's it. Maybe he is, you know, a big bad and he's just really good at acting like he's just a person. I don't know. But I'm interested to see how this all turns out. And also, the epilogue is Sonea showing this to Rothen. And we don't get to see his reaction to it. It ends with her being like, all right, there's something that the administrator told me you should see. And that's the end of the epilogue. So I have no idea what Rothen's reaction is going to be to this. But we know that he was frankly disturbed at the fact that the High Lord was able to, like, sense as much of the magic that she was doing out in the slums as he was able to. So yeah, so that's the end of the book. So there's a lot of like loose ends still. There was a lot of satisfying, like, human interaction, but not a great satisfying bit of justice served to Fergun. And I also want to mention the Lord Dannyl's Guide to Slum Slang at the end of the book, which is amazing because some of it is really obvious. Blood money, payment for assassination, sure. Boot is refusal, don't boot us. Like, all of this is very obvious. But then there's one, Capper, man who frequents brothels. What's the one that I've really liked? Grandmother means pimp. What? Goldmine is a man who prefers boys. Gauntlet, guard who is bribable or in the control of a thief. Heavies are important people, which heavy hitters, that makes sense. There was another one I feel like. Pick is recognize, understand. Punt is a smuggler. And Squimp, someone who double crosses the thieves, which is one that we got introduced to earlier, which I really liked. And I feel like there was another one. Oh, visitor means burglar. So there are a lot of, like, bits of slang in there that I found fun. Some of them are just logic and you could know what they meant in context, but some of them, grandmother being a pimp, I did no idea. So yeah, so I think that's it. So thank you guys so much for listening to these. Thank you again to Ashleigh for commissioning this. This was really fun to cover and just so, like, it was a surprise, not only, like, the commission coming through being, like, because I got it confused with the other book, but also I never expected the commissions to come so quickly for all of them that I was able to finish the book like this fast. Because there's still other books that I'm still working on from, like, months ago. So I'm hoping that those get wrapped up soon. We'll see. But thank you again to Ashleigh very much for commissioning so many of these. And I hope that all of you enjoyed them. Thank you, Martin, for coming to a couple of the crowdcasts. And I hope to see you all soon with the next book, the beginning of the next book. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.